Hello there, I'm Jimmy Vegas and this is the ultimate Unity tutorial for beginners, and welcome to episode 14. This tutorial we're going to take a look at post-processing. That's going to be our main focus of this tutorial, but I'm also going to bring in a little of ambience as well, just to kind of add to our atmosphere. Don't forget, click the subscribe button, click the bell icon as well, stay up to date with every tutorial in this series. And with that in mind, let's get to work. So like I said, mostly going to be post-processing this tutorial, but I'm going to bring in some audio just to kind of add to the scene. So I'm going to drag and drop this ambient sound, which you can get on the website free. Head over there, downloads and assets. And although we've dealt with sound effects before, we've dealt with two. So we've got the creaky door and we've got the dinging sound. This is going to be a little bit different because these other two were done on command. And this one is just going to be automatic. And all we really need to do to get this working is add to our first person controller right here. So we've got sounds, effects. So I'm going to right click and create empty and just have AMB, short for ambience. And within here, I'm going to create another one and just have this as summer, I guess, because it kind of is a summery noise. So it's just a case of dragging and dropping onto that object. Play on awake is ticked. We want it to be active. Loop, yes, we will have that looped because we want it to continuously play. And I'm going to reduce the volume just a little bit because I think it is quite loud when it starts. But generally, this is how the game now feels. There we go. So it just seems a little bit more like an atmosphere. So, post-processing. Here we go, guys. What is post-processing? In its simplest terms, it's a way of creating image effects which make the game look better or worse depending on what effect you are going for. How do you get post-processing? Easy. Firstly, head to the asset store, and I am right here. If you don't like this version of the asset store, you can change to the old one here. All we need to do is at the top type in post-processing, and you'll see it right here. Post-processing stack. So click on it, you'll be taken to the page, and all you need to do is just import or download that button right there. Make sure you are logged in. And as I say, if you're on the old store and it kind of looks like this, it is just a case of game, post-processing, and you'll find it right there. So look for that image from Unity Technologies and download or import right there, and it will bring it into your project. I've already gone ahead and brought it in to save time. Here it is right here. What we're going to deal with is in here, runtime. And to get all this working, we need to attach this post-processing behavior script onto our camera. It needs to be attached to any camera that renders within the game, as long as you want it to have that image the same. So let's drag and drop this post-processing file onto our first-person character. Not controller. Make sure it's character. The reason is the camera is attached to our first person character. Now, before we can get into creating these post-processing effects, we need to change a couple of settings within Unity to kind of get the most out of what we're doing here. Firstly, we need to go to Edit, go down to Project Settings, and then go to Graphics. Sorry, not Graphics. Well, what am I on about? It's actually Quality. So although we're dealing with the graphics, it's actually quality that we're changing here. We need to make sure that anti-aliasing is disabled by default. It may be set to this as default. We just need to make sure it is set as disabled. Why? Well, post-processing has that for us. Why do we need it there? So next thing we need to do is go to our first person character where our camera is. And we need to change the rendering path. We're going to need to change this to deferred. And when we click this, we will notice a difference in the scene view. We also need to turn off the MSAA, which actually stands for multi-sampling anti-aliasing. This can be more of a strain on the processor, but you can achieve better lighting with what we're doing here, having this as deferred and turning off MSAA. So like I say, it is a bit more of a strain, but it will look better. So we turn that off. And we also need to tick HDR right there. So we need to allow it. And it's a way of the camera getting kind of, how can I explain, better control viewing the scene when we apply the post-processing. So it makes everything look even better than what it can do. So how does all this work now? We've got this post-processing installed, we've got our settings all set. How do we apply these image effects? Well, what we need to do is let's actually do it in this folder, in the runtime folder, but it can be in any folder. Right click, create, and down here you'll see post-processing profile. Click it and name it whatever you want. I'm going to call this ppjv. So what is this file exactly? This file is basically a way of containing the data for all of our post-processing. So it's just essentially a data file, and we can do different things with it. The great thing about how this works is we can actually do it real time whilst in the game and save the settings. So when you create it, it may look like this. It may look with all these closed up. It may look like with just one of them down like that. But generally, I think by default, if you've not dealt with post-processing before, it should look like this with fog automatically ticked. And if we click fog, this doesn't really matter too much at this point. So some of these effects I'm not going to go into at this point because there is no point of me doing it right now because the scene isn't exactly set for some of these settings. But I'll explain that pretty much all of them and what we do with them and when we can use them, when we won't use them. But we'll also explore them as we go further into the series as well. So next thing we need to do is go on our first person character and drag and drop the profile over here in the component. You won't see any difference. However, this is where it all begins. So our next task is to press play. And we'll see in the game view what our game currently looks like, which is exactly the same as how we left it. However, if we click our post-processing file now, we can actually start playing around. So, first thing to do is let's tick anti-aliasing. So let's turn it back on. Now, anti-aliasing is a way of kind of making the jagged edges seem less jagged, kind of making the game look a little smoother, a little bit more somewhat realistic. I normally stick with the fast approximate method. The temporal can make it look a little bit, well, as you can see, not quite right, but then you're playing around with these settings, and by all means feel free to play around with these settings. You can probably get a good kind of image going on here. As you can see, if we change the sharpen, change it up and down, we can see just how much that affects it. But I normally stick with the fast approximate anti-aliasing. I feel like this is less strain on the processor. So next up, if we close that down just by clicking on the words, is Ambient Occlusion. Now, Ambient Occlusion helps light and shadows work in places that they otherwise would struggle in. For example, tight corners. So if we tick Ambient Occlusion, we can see straight away that the image kind of turns a little bit, not dark, but we can actually play around with this setting here, the radius. And we can see over here that we have a kind of a shadow being cast there. So it looks okay, but then we get further on and that's how it starts looking a little bit like some kind of horror game. If you've accidentally changed a setting that you're not happy with and can't remember what it originally was, you can click the little menu button here and click on Reset. So I'm going to change the intensity to probably 1.2 and change the radius up just slightly to, yeah, about that. And I'm going to keep sample count as, in fact, change it to high. I think in this kind of scene it's not going to matter too much, but I guess you can work with it if you want to. So let's see how that works out for us. So moving on, we've got screen space reflection. This isn't really going to matter in this type of scene because there's nothing massively reflective going on here. This is more useful for inside places. Think of like some kind of, I don't know, a hospital or something. That's going to be more likely to be useful within that scene. But it's worth explaining that not every one of these is going to work correctly with your scene. It just kind of depends what your scene is. Next we've got depth of field. Not really too much we can use here, but you can see if we select it, change a couple of settings, we can see what's going on. We get the blurriness going on. This is more kind of photography things going on. You would more associate a depth of field with what a photographer deals with. So again, this scene isn't really massively relevant for that. So I'm going to turn that one off. Next one, motion blur, is exactly what it means. It blurs the motion. So as you've seen in probably quite a lot of games, you do get the motion blur, and the idea of that is when a camera quickly shifts, it kind of produces a blur effect. Even if you do it with your eyes normally, you still get that blur effect. So if we enable it, we're not going to see much of a difference. However, if we go into our scene view, we can see straight away just how much things change with this blur. And this is something that you can work with as well. So you could change the sample count, you can change the frame blending if you wanted to, but then you're just kind of getting into realms of it's too blurry. So I'd recommend keeping this quite low, but keeping the sample count somewhat not too high, kind of in the middle a little bit. And shutter angle, again, that's entirely up to you. It's the exposure time. So if you had this as full 360, you can see how much blurrier it becomes. So let's reset this, and let's keep it as almost default. So I'm going to increase that to 20. Next up is, let's close that one up. Next up is Adaptation. And the idea of this, excuse me, is when we come into bright scenes, into dark, and vice versa. So if we select Adaptation, the scene goes dark straight away because it's just the way it's kind of working. It makes the idea of the camera, like say, inside and outside, and we can actually get around this by reducing the histogram filter. You can see this large range here. If we drag this to the start and then decrease the range, we can see how much of an impact that's having. So if I bring it to here and then bring it up, you can see it slowly fading to what it would be. So if we have that round about there, you see the scene slowly fading back to brightness. So that's roughly going to be about what we need, and that's all the adaptation is. It's kind of getting inside areas that look a little bit darker and whatever else, and you can change the minimums, maximums if you want to, but if not, I will keep them as the default. I think by default a lot of the settings on post-processing are actually quite decent. So next up, if we close Adaptation, is Bloom. Bloom is something which I feel is overused in video games. However, that's not to say that it isn't a good thing, because Bloom is. If we enable Bloom, we're not going to see too much of a difference at the moment. I think we'll probably see a little bit of a difference in the sky. However, this is where everything comes into play, because the next two are where the style of the game and how it looks really change. And hopefully already you can see kind of like a glowing on this little gem here when it turns. That's the reflection happening because of the bloom. So we're going to want the intensity maybe up a little, and you can see just how much this now affects everything. It's a bit crazy. So that's way too much, I think. However, getting all this just right is really going to help. So if we set the threshold a little bit lower and the intensity just a little bit higher, turn on anti-flicker and also increase the radius, you can see how this is now working for us and how it looks in the game. So what is bloom exactly? Well, bloom is a way of theoretically highlighting lighter pixels that you see on the screen. So the range is kind of, well, we would set it here. So if we set it really low, we can see just how much that's blooming, and blooming is absolutely insane in that. That's way too much. So I think for now we'll leave the bloom setting as it is, and we saw right there how the eye adaptation worked. If we face this way and then quickly face this way, we can see how the eye adaptation is working in the back. So it's our eyes adjusting to looking at bright lights. So next up is color grading, and this one is vital. When combined with bloom, this one can absolutely make or break a game. If we turn it on, we'll see a little bit of a difference, and I like to usually set this as filmic because I just feel it adds that extra oomph to a scene. And as I said, it can either make or break how a game looks. And already you can see just how this game is looking. It is looking a lot different than what it was at the beginning of the tutorial. However, we can make it look more different. I think we're going to increase the contrast, and you can see how that's changed there. I'm going to decrease the saturation slightly. And post-exposure, we could change this quite high, but you can see how this reacts to the game. That's quite a lot. If we have it as 0, and look around, we can see how that is working. So that obviously means we need to increase the exposure. And we'll increase this probably to about there. And now if we go back to bloom and decrease the threshold, you can see again how that's having an impact. So this kind of gives the impression of a scene that's maybe like a dream or a flashback or something, and that is what post-processing can be used for as well. Different scenes heading back in time. But if we increase the threshold a little bit more, we'll also increase the intensity, decrease the intensity. Let's bring the threshold down just a little bit more. You can see how this is now having an impact on how the game looks. So working these two together is absolutely important. And I guess we could also change the temperature up or down. You'd see how it works. But generally, this is probably best set as 0. So, as I say, working with these two is essential. And it will take a little bit of time to get it looking just as you would hope it to look. Next up, if we go to, in fact, user LUT is, I'll quickly explain that. It's basically created in an external program for color grading, and you would just import it into here, and it's kind of does the color grading for you, as long as you know what you're doing in a separate program, which I'm not going to explain because this is Unity. Next one is Chromatic oh God, I can't get my words out, guys. Aberration. Chromatic aberration. And if we tick it, we can see it gives a weird kind of look around the sides. Now, this is kind of okay, but if we have it as 0 and then set it as 1, you can see what I mean. Now, if anyone has played Resident Evil Revelations 2 and they know about the glasps in that game, then this is kind of what's happening here. So we could have this set if we wanted to. If not, I would turn it off. It's up to you. Next is grain, and this simulates the kind of white noise that you would see on screen. I don't think this game is really designed for the grain, so I'm not kind of going to have it on. If you were creating maybe a survival horror, then quite possibly you would have that on. So let's turn that off. And finally, vignette or vignette, however you want to pronounce it, adds around the sides. Again, that's more maybe kind of a survival horror kind of game going on. But you can see just how much of an impact this is now having on our game. So if I leave that vignette on, we could change it if we wanted to. Not really going to make too much of a difference, but you can see how it's reacting around the edges of the screen. And dithering is not something we'll go into, at least not yet. So, bloom and color grading. I think these are the most important two aspects of dealing with post-processing. I really feel like they can make or break how the game looks. And I think it's about kind of controlling just how much you want your game to bloom and how much you want the color grading to be changed. We could always change the contrast down and you can see what's going on here. But another way, and I know a lot of people want to kind of go for this, you can always change the saturation to nothing, and that gives the good old black and white. Set that back to 1 and we can see how this now looks. So it's kind of cool. So I'm going to wander around. So post-processing, we're going to deal more with it as we go further into development. But you can see in here we're having a problem with actually seeing anything. That's something we can always deal with because that comes down to post-processing. How does it? Well, if we go to our first person character, turn off post-processing, we can see a little better. But let's come out of here. This is how our scene did look. And if we turn post-processing back on, this is now how it looks. So you may feel this looks a little bit dark. Well, we can always sort that, can't we? Because that's what post-processing is. We can change how these things look. But if we turn the bloom off and the color grading off, you can see it is these two that cause the most effect. I quite like how that looks. So there's our eye adaptation working again. Remember, guys, if you struggle with anything, you can always reset. If you feel you've done something wrong or whatever, never be afraid to kind of work with the settings at all. So I'm going to set this post exposure back to 1. And remember, lighting also plays a part in everything in a scene. So if we go to our directional light and let's rotate, for example, you can see how much of an impact that now has on the scene. So it kind of looks cool as it is, I think. Yeah, that's not too bad. So speaking of lighting, the last thing I'm actually going to take a quick look at here is, in fact, I'll actually stop the game first. And if we press stop, luckily for us, all those settings that we worked on have saved. So the idea of post-processing works real time, like I said. If we go to Window, Rendering, Light Settings, I'm going to change the source to color. And you can already see how much of an impact that has now had on the scene as soon as I've changed it. So remember, all of these things together matter. It's not just all about post-processing. It's not all about the lighting. It's not all about skyboxes. They all matter as one particular thing. So there we go. We can see this world is now coming alive much better than it was, like I say, at the beginning of this tutorial. So as we go further and further into development, things are going to look better and better in this game because we're going to delve into a lot of different things. So what I would recommend now is you work with your post-processing, you get something cool kind of going on, and yeah, you really work with it. So what I might actually do, before I quickly finish this, is turn my exposure up just a little more. What do I really want? In fact, I'm going to have that back as 1. I'm going to change the bloom. Let's have the intensity up, and we can see what's going on there. Got to be careful with that, guys. You have to be careful. So yeah, we'll leave that there for now. We've done quite a bit this tutorial. I'm quite impressed with how this is now looking. See, if we turn that down, it's all about playing around. You could spend hours upon hours working with post-processing, guys. You really could. So guys, until the next tutorial, we are going to deal with what should we do next time? Oh, I saw a couple of comments asking about the door, so we're going to kind of make the door close. We'll deal with the interior of that building, and we'll also create the option to open it with the E button. So guys, until that next tutorial, thank you very much for watching.